On a Sunday morning in late November 2024, inside the sprawling sanctuary of the Potter's House in Dallas, Texas, Bishop T.D. Jakes stood at the pulpit doing what he had done for over 4 decades. He was preaching. His voice, that unmistakable baritone that had filled stadiums, sold millions of books, and made him arguably the most powerful pastor in America, was rolling through the congregation like thunder. And then, mid-sentence, something happened that no one in that building will ever forget. His words began to slur. His massive frame, the frame of a man who had commanded rooms with presidents and billionaires, started to sway. His eyes, usually laser-focused on the crowd, drifted somewhere distant. Deacons rushed the stage. The congregation gasped. Cameras that live-streamed every service to millions around the world captured the moment in horrifying real time. Bishop T.D. Jakes, the man they called God's General, was collapsing. Not just physically, but in every way a man can collapse. Because by that point, in late 2024, the walls had already been closing in. His name had been dragged into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern American history. His congregation, once 30,000 strong, had been hemorrhaging members for months. His financial empire, built on decades of prosperity gospel preaching, book deals, and media ventures, was cracking under scrutiny it had never faced before. And the mansion, that $13 million estate that sat like a palace on the outskirts of Dallas, had become less a symbol of divine blessing and more a symbol of everything his critics said was wrong with the modern megachurch. What happened to T.D. Jakes in 2024 was not a single event. It was an avalanche. And to understand how one of the most influential religious figures in American history lost nearly everything in the span of 12 months, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to understand who this man was before the fall. Thomas Dexter Jakes was born on June 9, 1957 in South Charleston, West Virginia. His father, Ernest Jakes Sr., was a businessman who ran a janitorial company. His mother, Odith, was an educator. By all accounts, young Thomas grew up in a household that valued hard work and faith in equal measure. But his childhood was far from easy. His father suffered from kidney disease, and Thomas spent much of his youth helping care for him, watching the man who was supposed to be invincible slowly deteriorate. Ernest Jakes Sr. died when Thomas was 16 years old. That loss shaped everything that came after. The boy who watched his father die became a man obsessed with building something that could not be taken away. He started preaching at the age of 19, not in a grand cathedral, not on television. He preached in storefronts in small churches in the hills of West Virginia, sometimes to congregations of no more than 10 people. He worked multiple jobs to support himself. Yes, he sold vegetables door to door. He dug ditches. He worked at the local Union Carbide chemical plant. For years, T.D. Jakes was nobody. And that is an important detail, because the mythology that later surrounded him, the idea that he was somehow always destined for greatness, erases the decade-plus of genuine struggle that preceded his rise. In 1980, he founded Greater Emmanuel Temple of Faith in Montgomery, West Virginia, with just 10 members. The church grew slowly. Jakes supplemented his income however he could, and there were times, by his own admission, when his family relied on government assistance to get by. His wife, Sarita, whom he married in 1982, stood beside him through those lean years. They had 5 children together. The prosperity he would later preach about was nowhere to be found in his own life for a very long time. The turning point came in 1993. Jakes was invited to speak at a conference hosted by Bishop Carlton Pearson in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called Azusa. His sermon was based on a biblical passage from the book of Luke, focused on a woman who had been bent over and crippled for 18 years before Jesus healed her. Jakes titled the message, "Woman, Thou Art Loosed." The response was electric. Women in the audience wept, screamed, collapsed. The emotional power of that sermon was so overwhelming that it essentially launched a movement. Jakes turned it into a book. Woman, Thou Art Loosed was published in 1993 and sold millions of copies. It became a cultural phenomenon in the Black church and beyond. He followed it with a conference series by the same name that drew tens of thousands of women every year. By the mid-1990s, T.D. Jakes was no longer a small-town preacher from West Virginia. He was a brand. Before I go further, quick question for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching this from right now, what time it is where you are, and what you do for a living. I am always amazed at the incredible range of people who watch this channel. From doctors and lawyers in Lagos to students in London to truck drivers in Texas, all of us gathered here to learn something. And if you are new to Professor Archive, hit that subscribe button. We bring you deep, well-researched stories just like this one every single week. If you really love what we do, consider dropping a super thanks on this video. It goes a long way. All right, let us get back into this. In 1996, T.D. Jakes made the move that would define the rest of his career. He relocated from West Virginia to Dallas, Texas, and founded the Potter's House. The name came from the biblical book of Jeremiah, chapter 18, where God tells the prophet to go to the Potter's house to receive a message. The metaphor was clear. Jakes was saying that God reshapes broken people that know life is beyond repair. And people believed it. Within its first few years, the Potter's House grew to over 28,000 members, making it one of the largest megachurches in America. The campus itself was staggering, a 191,000 square foot sanctuary, satellite locations, a media production company, a record label, a film production arm. Jakes was not just building a church, he was building an empire. And the empire paid well. T.D. Jakes moved into a world of wealth that would have been unrecognizable to the man who once sold vegetables door to door. He purchased a mansion in the White Rock Lake area of Dallas, a sprawling estate reportedly valued at $5.6 million. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, his real estate holdings expanded. He acquired a stunning property in Fort Worth. He was connected to a $13 million estate. He wore custom suits. He flew private. He drove luxury vehicles. He socialized with the wealthiest and most powerful people in America. And for a long time, nobody really questioned it. Or rather, the people who questioned it were easily dismissed. Critics who pointed out the contradiction between preaching to the poor and living like a king were labeled haters, or people who did not understand the theology of prosperity. The prosperity gospel, the idea that God wants his faithful followers to be materially wealthy, and that financial abundance is a sign of divine favor, had been around long enough that Jakes did not have to defend it much. He had predecessors and contemporaries who preached the same message. Creflo Dollar, Joel Osteen, Kenneth Copeland, Benny Hinn. The prosperity gospel was a billion-dollar industry, and T.D. Jakes was perhaps its most charismatic ambassador. But here's what most people did not know, or did not want to look at too closely. The Potter's House, like most megachurches, was not required to disclose its finances publicly. Churches in the United States are tax-exempt under Section 501(c)(3) of the Internal Revenue Code, and unlike other nonprofits, they are not required to file a Form 990 with the IRS. This means the public has no way of knowing exactly how much money the Potter's House takes in, how much of that money goes to T.D. Jakes personally, or how the rest is spent. Jakes has stated in interviews that his wealth comes primarily from his books, films, and business ventures, rather than his pastoral salary. He has said his church salary is modest, but without financial transparency, those claims are impossible to verify. What is verifiable is the scale of his commercial operation. He authored over 40 books, many of them bestsellers. He produced and appeared in multiple films, including Woman Thou Art Loosed, the movie in 2004, Jumping the Broom in 2011, and Miracles from Heaven in 2016. He launched a talk show. He partnered with corporations. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine in 2001, which called him America's Best Preacher. Forbes estimated his net worth at approximately $20 million, though some estimates placed it significantly higher. For decades, the machine worked. The brand was untouchable, the congregation grew, the money flowed, the influence expanded. T.D. Jakes prayed at the inaugurations of presidents. He was consulted by CEOs. He was by almost any measure the most successful pastor in America. And then came Diddy. In September 2024, Sean Combs, the music mogul known as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or simply Diddy, was arrested by federal agents in New York City and charged with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. The indictment, filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, painted a picture of a man who had allegedly used his power and wealth to coerce and abuse victims over a period of more than a decade. The indictment described events referred to as freak-offs, which were alleged to be elaborately produced sexual performances that Combs orchestrated and sometimes recorded. These events allegedly involved commercial sex workers and were facilitated by drugs, threats, and coercion. Now, what does any of this have to do with T.D. Jakes? On the surface, the connection between a megachurch pastor and a hip-hop mogul might seem unlikely. But T.D. Jakes and Diddy had a well-documented relationship that went back years. They had been photographed together at events. They were known to move in overlapping social circles. In the world of black celebrity, the intersection of entertainment and faith is not unusual. Many pastors cultivate relationships with entertainers, and many entertainers maintain public displays of faith. But when the Diddy indictment dropped, and especially when the details of those alleged freak-offs became public, the internet did what the internet does. It started connecting dots. Some of those dots were legitimate questions, others were wild speculation. The problem for Jakes was that certain allegations and rumors, circulating on social media and in various online discussions, specifically placed his name in proximity to Diddy's alleged activities. Let me be very precise here because this matters. As of the time of this script, T.D. Jakes has not been charged with any crime. He has not been named as a defendant or co-conspirator in any federal indictment. What happened was that his name began circulating in connection with the Diddy case through social media posts, online commentary, and certain unverified claims. Some of the allegations came from individuals who claimed to have knowledge of Diddy's parties and alleged that various high-profile figures, including Jakes, had attended. These claims spread like wildfire across platforms like X, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Whether any of them are true is a matter that has not been established in any court of law. What is not debatable is the damage they caused. For a man whose entire brand was built on moral authority, the mere association with the Diddy scandal was catastrophic. You have to understand what T.D. Jakes represented to his congregation and to millions of followers around the world. He was not just a preacher, he was, in the minds of many, a direct conduit to God. He was the man people turned to when their marriages were falling apart, when they lost children, when they faced their darkest hours. He was the voice that told them to hold on, that God had a plan, that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. When that voice is suddenly associated, even through rumor and innuendo, with allegations of the most depraved kind, the cognitive dissonance is shattering. People do not process it rationally, they process it emotionally. And emotionally, it felt like a betrayal. Attendance at the Potter's house began to decline. Not overnight, but steadily. Week after week, there were more empty seats. The satellite campuses, which had been thriving, saw similar drops. Online viewership of services, which had surged during the COVID-19 pandemic, fell off a cliff. Members who had tithed faithfully for decades quietly found other churches. Some left the faith entirely. The whisper network that exists in every congregation, the quiet conversations in parking lots and over phone calls, was in overdrive. People were talking, and what they were saying was not good. Jakes initially tried to address the situation obliquely. In sermons during the fall of 2024, he made references to attacks from the enemy, to lies and slander, to the cost of being in the public eye. He quoted scripture about persecution and endurance, but he did not directly address the Diddy allegations by name. This strategy, which might have worked in an earlier era, was disastrous in the age of social media. His silence was interpreted as guilt. Every day that he did not issue a full-throated denial with specifics was a day the narrative slipped further from his control. And then there was the financial pressure. The decline in attendance meant a decline in tithes and offerings, which are the lifeblood of any church. The Potter's house had significant overhead. The campus required maintenance, the staff required salaries, the media operations required funding. The various ministries and outreach programs required resources. When the weekly take drops, the effects are not immediate, but they compound quickly. There were reports, some confirmed and some speculative, that the Potter's house was facing financial difficulties by late 2024. Staff layoffs were rumored. Programs were scaled back. And then there was the mansion. For years, T.D. Jakes' real estate holdings had been a point of contention. But in the context of the scandals and the financial pressure, they became indefensible in the court of public opinion. The lavish properties that had once been framed as blessings from God were now framed as evidence of a grifter living off the desperation of working-class believers. Reports circulated that Jakes was dealing with significant property-related financial issues. Whether he technically lost his mansion in the way that phrase usually implies, or whether he was forced to sell or restructure due to financial pressures, the symbolism was devastating either way. The palace was crumbling. Now let me add another layer to this, because the T.D. Jakes story does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within the larger context of the American megachurch model, reaching what might be its breaking point. For decades, the megachurch operated on a simple but powerful formula. A charismatic leader builds a personal brand. That brand attracts followers. Those followers tithe. The tithes fund the operation and the leader's lifestyle. The leader's lifestyle becomes aspirational, which attracts more followers. The cycle repeats. But this model has a fatal vulnerability. It is entirely dependent on the credibility and moral authority of the leader. When the leader falls, everything falls. We have seen this pattern before. Jim Bakker and the PTL scandal in 1987. Ted Haggard in 2006. Eddie Long in 2010. Mark Driscoll. Carl Lentz of Hillsong. Jerry Falwell Jr. The list is long and getting longer. Each time, the pattern is the same. A leader who is treated as nearly infallible is revealed to have clay feet, and the entire structure built around them shudders. What makes the Jakes situation different is the scale. The Potter's House was not just a megachurch, it was a cultural institution. It was arguably the most important black church in America. Its influence extended into politics, entertainment, business, and philanthropy. When something that large starts to crack, the reverberations are felt far beyond Dallas. There is another dimension here that is deeply uncomfortable but must be addressed. The allegations swirling around Jakes in connection with the Diddy scandal included not just claims about attendance at parties, but more specific and disturbing insinuations. Again, I want to emphasize that these remain unproven allegations and social media speculation. But the nature of the claims, which touched on issues of sexuality and sexual conduct, struck at the very heart of the theological framework that Jakes had built his career on. The Potter's House, like many churches in the black evangelical tradition, maintained conservative positions on matters of sexuality. Jakes himself had navigated this territory carefully over the years, at times seeming to soften his stance and at other times reaffirming traditional positions. But the allegations forced a conversation that the congregation was not prepared to have, not about theology in the abstract, but about the personal conduct of their spiritual leader. It was excruciating. Then came the physical collapse. On that Sunday in late November 2024, when Jakes suffered what was later described as a health emergency during his sermon, the visual was searing. Here was a man who had seemed invincible, who had possessed a physical presence that matched his oratorical power, literally crumbling at the pulpit. The footage went viral within minutes. It was shared millions of times across every platform. Some people shared it with genuine concern and prayers for his recovery. Others shared it with a barely concealed sense of vindication, as if the body was merely catching up to what the spirit had already suffered. His family released statements saying he was receiving medical care and asking for privacy. Reports indicated he may have suffered a transient ischemic attack, sometimes called a mini-stroke, though the family did not provide extensive medical details publicly. He was hospitalized. He stepped back from preaching. And for the first time in decades, the Potter's House pulpit was occupied by someone other than T.D. Jakes on a sustained basis. The timing of the health crisis could not have been worse, or from a narrative perspective, more poetically devastating. It came at the exact moment when the church needed its leader most, when the scandal was raging, when the congregation was confused and frightened, when the financial pressures were mounting. And the leader was gone, physically unable to stand and fight. Some within the congregation interpreted it as a sign from God, though they disagreed about what the sign meant. Some said it was God humbling a man who had grown too proud. Others said it was the enemy attacking God's servant at his most vulnerable. Still others, perhaps the most pragmatic, simply noted that an enormous amount of stress over a sustained period does terrible things to the human body, and that a 67-year-old man carrying the weight that Jakes was carrying was a candidate for exactly this kind of medical event. In the weeks that followed, the question on everyone's mind was whether the Potter's House could survive. not as a building, but as a functioning institution. The church had been built entirely around one man's charisma and brand. Without that man at the helm, what was it? This is the existential question facing every personality-driven megachurch, and the Jakes situation put it in the sharpest possible relief. Could the church transition to new leadership? Jakes' son, Jermaine Jakes, and his daughter Sarah Jakes Roberts, who had become a prominent preacher in her own right, were both potential successors. Sarah Jakes Roberts had built a significant following through her own ministry, conferences, and books. She was in many ways the most logical heir. But succession in a megachurch is not like succession in a corporation. The congregation's attachment is personal, almost familial. They did not come to hear a Jakes, they came to hear T.D. Jakes. And if T.D. Jakes could not preach, many of them simply would not come. Let me step back for a moment and talk about something that does not get discussed enough in these conversations: the human cost beyond the famous name. When a megachurch implodes, it is not just the pastor who suffers. It is the thousands of ordinary people whose lives were interwoven with the institution. The staff members who lose their jobs. The volunteers who gave thousands of hours. The small business owners whose livelihoods depended on the economic ecosystem that the church created. The people who built genuine, beautiful friendships through church fellowships, and who now feel those friendships are tainted by association. The people who were genuinely helped by the church's ministries, the addiction recovery programs, the job training, the food pantries, the counseling services, and who now watch those programs shrink or disappear because the money is drying up. The collateral damage of a megachurch scandal is enormous, and it almost never gets adequate attention because the cameras are focused on the pastor. There is also the broader cultural significance. T.D. Jakes was not just a pastor. He was a symbol of Black excellence, of the possibility that a boy from South Charleston, West Virginia, with nothing, could build something extraordinary through faith and determination. For millions of Black Americans, his success was their success. His fall, therefore, was not just a personal tragedy, it was a communal wound. It fed into a painful narrative about Black leadership and the ways in which systems of power corrupt even the most well-intentioned. It reopened conversations about the prosperity gospel, and whether it is, as its critics have long argued, little more than a mechanism for transferring wealth from poor communities to rich preachers. These are not comfortable conversations, but they are necessary ones. As 2024 turned into 2025, the picture was bleak. T.D. Jakes was recovering from his health crisis, but had not returned to regular preaching. The Diddy case was still winding its way through the federal court system, and every new development brought a fresh wave of speculation about who else might be implicated. The Potter's House was still open, but operating in what could only be described as crisis mode. The real estate situation remained murky, with various reports about property sales, valuations, and financial restructuring. And the reputation, that most valuable and most fragile of assets, was in tatters. Here is what I think is the most important thing to understand about the T.D. Jakes story, and it is something that applies far beyond the world of megachurches. We live in a culture that is addicted to the narrative of the great man. We want to believe that extraordinary individuals can transcend ordinary limitations. We want our heroes to be superhuman, and we invest in them accordingly. We give them our money, our trust, our devotion, our hope. We build them up to heights that no human being can sustain. And then, when they inevitably reveal themselves to be human, flawed, complicated, capable of the same failings as anyone else, we are not just disappointed, we are furious. Because it's not just their failure, it's ours. We chose to believe, we chose to follow, we chose to write those tithe checks. And that makes us complicit in a way that is very hard to sit with. T.D. Jakes may or may not be guilty of the things social media has accused him of. That is for courts and investigations to determine, not for YouTube videos, and I want to be very clear about that distinction. But what is beyond dispute is that the structure he built was fragile in the way that all personality-driven structures are fragile. It could withstand market forces, competition, changing demographics, even a global pandemic. But it could not withstand the loss of the one thing it was entirely built upon, the perceived moral authority of its founder. The ancient Greeks had a word for it: hubris, the excessive pride that leads to downfall. They wrote tragedies about it thousands of years ago because they understood something fundamental about human nature. The higher you build, the more spectacular the fall. And T.D. Jakes built very, very high. Whether there is a redemption arc in this story remains to be seen. Jakes is a man who preached about redemption for a living. He told millions of people that no pit was too deep, that no failure was final, that the potter could always reshape the clay. The question now is whether he believes his own sermons, whether the man who told everyone else that restoration was possible can find restoration for himself, and whether the people who once hung on his every word will be willing to listen again. What we do know is this. In the span of roughly 12 months from early 2024 to early 2025, T.D. Jakes went from being the most powerful pastor in America to a cautionary tale. He did not lose everything in a single dramatic moment. He lost it the way most people lose things, gradually, then suddenly. The congregation thinned slowly before it thinned quickly. The financial pressures built before they broke through. The reputation eroded in whispers before it collapsed in shouts. And the body, carrying the accumulated weight of decades of relentless work and months of unbearable stress, finally said enough. It is one of the most dramatic falls from grace in the history of the American church, and it is still unfolding. The Diddy trial has the potential to produce revelations that could change everything in any direction. New information could exonerate Jakes entirely, or it could implicate him further. The uncertainty itself is corrosive because, in the absence of definitive answers, people fill the void with their own narratives. One of the great ironies of T.D. Jakes' story is that his most famous sermon, the one that launched his career, was about a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. Bent over by life, by trauma, by circumstances beyond her control. The message of that sermon was that Jesus could make her stand upright again. That no matter how long you have been bent, you can be straightened. Jakes preached that message to millions of broken people, and it changed their lives. Now he is the one who is bent. Now he is the one who needs the miracle he spent his career promising to others. I do not know how this story ends. Nobody does. But I know that it deserves to be told honestly, with all its complexity, without either canonizing the man or demonizing him before the facts are fully known. Because T.D. Jakes is not a cartoon villain. He is a human being who did extraordinary things and who may have also done terrible things and who is currently somewhere in a house in Dallas trying to figure out what comes next. That is the reality. It is messier than a headline. It is messier than a social media post, but it is the truth, or at least as close to the truth as we can get right now.